deep inside, there's a huge part of me that's gone.
The horror is once you get out, trying to get back what you'd lost.
When you're on that side of the bars and there's no way, there's no hope, there's no crack, you give up.
Took away a big portion of my life, took away my life with my children.
I mean, what happened to the word investigation?
Helpless, fear, anger, and revenge, and wanting people to be held accountable for what had happened to me.
And why? Why did you do it? What possessed you to play God?
I knew my life was over right there.
Having my family taken away, everything taken away from me.
I had my life stolen away for 25.5 years for a crime I didn't commit. You can't get that time back.
Hi, I'm Kelly Fanson.
And I'm Kelly Lozon.
And this is Real Life Wrongs, where we dive into the stories, the crimes, and the hard times of the complicated world of wrongful convictions. Join us every week as we shed light on the heart-wrenching and controversial stories of wrongful convictions by examining the system errors that put innocent people behind bars.
Episode 4, Why in the World? Highlight case, Romeo Phillion. Guest, Hayley Cleary, Jessica Sutherland, Lindsay Malloy.
Let's imagine for a moment you're 8 years old. You're the middle of 9 children, and you and your twin brother are suddenly shipped off to a training school, better described as a residential school for orphans, truants, children from poor families who can no longer afford to support them. It's run by the Lay Order of Brothers of the Christian Schools, whoever they are, but I'm already uneasy, under the supervision of the provincial government. According to a class action lawsuit by former residents in the early 1990s, it was a living hell, with everything from beatings to sexual abuse. Once you're released, your life is riddled with various encounters with the law. You're not the best at weighing the pros and cons of your own actions. On August 9th, 1967, at 28 years old, you hear on the news that a firefighter named Leopold Roy was stabbed to death and police are looking for leads. You pay little attention to the story, going about your life, which includes run-ins with the law, but for lesser offenses, things like robbery, assault, nothing close to murder. January 1972, 4.5 years later from when you heard about the case, you're arrested for the armed robbery of a taxi driver. The police bring you into the station with your partner, your lover at the time, for questioning. While you're being interrogated, you ask the detective if your partner mentioned anything about the fireman's case. The detectives decide to play along, and they say your partner did divulge, quote, a lot of things you bragged about. The armed robbery charge that you're currently facing is completely unrelated to the open murder case that's more than 4.5 years old. But seeing as you tend to lack sound judgment, and perhaps because you want to make yourself look like a tough guy, in a typical foolish gesture, you blurt out that you committed the murder. You tell the detective that you did it and say that you will make a full confession after being allowed to meet with your partner. The police allow you to meet with your partner, and shortly after, true to your word, you sign the confession. What the police don't know is that you and your partner came up with a plan to cash in on the reward money that was being offered for information on who killed Leopold Roy. Your plan includes a confession. Information plus a confession means some easy reward money. But as the night of questioning goes on, you see it's not going the way you had planned. That confession is going to stick. You tell an officer that you are innocent and that you and your partner had planned to send the police on a wild goose chase while you collected the reward money for the murder. Confession recanted. But despite this quick recantation, the damage to your case has been irreparably done, and that fateful decision to confess will haunt you for the rest of your life. This is the story of Romeo Phillion, a wrongfully convicted Canadian who spent 31 years behind bars. Today on Real Life Wrongs, we're talking about false confessions, interrogation tactics, and how our own words can be used against us in our justice system. But first, let's get the details of the crime Romeo confessed to.
The afternoon of the murder, Leopold Roy's wife notices a suspicious man lurking in the hallway of their apartment building. She calls Leopold, who's working down in the basement, and when the suspicious prowler hears Mr. Roy coming upstairs, he runs through the hallway towards the stairs and jumps over the railing where he's caught by Leopold. Leopold yells out to his wife, who's close enough to hear, "You know what to do." While Leopold holds the man, she rushes to the phone to call the police. Next thing she hears is her husband calling out to her, but this time he's saying, "Don't call the police, call a doctor." When the police arrive, they find Leopold on the stairs, covered in blood with a stab wound just below his heart. The suspicious man is long gone.
Okay, Kelly, explain a false confession.
So from a legal perspective, a confession is a criminal suspect's oral or written acknowledgement of guilt, and it will often include details of the crime.
So that individual is saying, I did it, and this is how I did it.
Exactly. So a false confession is admitting that you did something that you didn't actually do.
Okay, so why in the world would someone choose to do this?
I don't think there's really an easy answer to that. There's a number of reasons why somebody would confess to a crime they didn't commit. And generally, it all depends on the circumstances of the crime or the interrogation or even the possible consequences that the person is facing.
Okay, so we're not just talking about one kind of confession here. Something tells me this is something we need to break down.
Indeed, it is. And so, long story short, there's three broad categories of false confessions. So there's voluntary, coerced internalized, and coerced compliant.
Okay, so let's start with voluntary. This isn't the result of being brought in by the police and interrogated. This is someone who's simply come forward and said, it was me, I confess. But even more specifically, someone who comes forward and admits to something they didn't do.
Exactly. And I know this sounds bizarre, but it's actually happened in a bunch of high-profile cases. Most famous example is probably the kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindbergh's son.
So Charles Lindbergh, his son was kidnapped in 1932, like right out of his crib. This case was highly publicized. There were around 200 people who came forward to volunteer confessions, and all of them were false. So that's a big number. But the point here is there are always people who come forward surrounding well-publicized cases to basically offer a false confession.
Exactly. So the next kind of false confession is the coerced internalized confession. And these confessions usually happen when the person being interrogated comes to believe that they actually committed the crime.
So this one is the most troubling one. And quite frankly, it's baffling. You didn't do it, but you say you did. And then you actually believe you did it. As an actor, I've had to imagine myself in many situations, but I've never actually believed I've done something I haven't. It just seems very unusual. And it seems like it's a deeply psychological kind of problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this, like you said, it's baffling and it's bizarre. And thing is, it's a real thing. So these confessions usually happen as a result of the suggestive language that's being fed to them throughout the interrogation. And so over time, the suspect ends up forming false memories of a crime that they didn't commit. So obviously, this is only going to happen if the suspect doesn't have any clear memories of the day or the time in question. And then you couple that with the fact that they don't have any confidence in what they believe actually happened. So with all these voids in their memory, they end up blending their memories with the suggestive information that's being fed to them. And they end up at a point where they can't even tell the difference between their actual memories and the stuff they're being told. So, like, I don't want to make it sound like this happens all the time, but there are some well-known examples where this happened, like the Paul Ingram case.
Right. So that was a crazy case. Paul Ingram was a well-known politician in his community, and he was accused of sexually assaulting his children and of performing satanic rituals in his backyard, where it was said that he sacrificed at least 25 babies. And after being questioned by the police, he confessed to these crimes. But what's really strange about this case is that he was later questioned by memory experts. And during these exchanges, the experts presented Ingram with completely fabricated crimes. So Ingram initially denied these crimes and said they never happened. But when he was told to go home and sleep on it, he came back the next day and confessed to those crimes too. So he was even told that these new crimes had been made up as a test of his memory, and still he insisted that these memories were just as real to him as anything else. So, I can't help but wonder if there's some unusual wiring there, because that is very extreme. But I suppose that what most people would think is someone confesses to something they didn't do, or confesses to something they've come to believe they've done. Ipso facto, the human brain is a fascinating thing.
Yes, it is. And I mean, truth is, no matter how much we try to figure it out, it still seems that it's mostly a mystery to us. So that aside, the third kind of false confession is the coerced compliant confession. And I think this is what we most commonly think of when we talk about false confessions.
The coerced compliant confession. So these are the confessions we see most on TV and film, like CSI time, Law and Order, good cop, bad cop. Like, would you like a cigarette? You must be thirsty. Here's a Fanta. Or listen, bucko, there's no cigarettes and Fanta for you unless you fess up. Is that kind of like what we're talking about?
Pretty much. I mean, maybe not exactly like that, but yes. So the confessions usually happen because of an interrogation where there are threats or violence or, withholding basic needs.
A Fanta.
Yes, definitely a need. And in those cases, the suspect will give a confession just to get out of the situation or to get something that was promised. So what's important here, though, so what's important here is that even though they confess, they're fully aware that they didn't commit the crime.
So basically, the suspect will confess just to end the interrogation because it's, been going on for so many hours at that point, and it's important to note that tunnel vision, check out episode 2 of our podcast, is usually a driving factor in these interrogations because the interrogator is or has become convinced of the suspect's guilt and refuses to consider the possibility that the suspect may be innocent or that the confession is false. I mean, seriously, though, these false confessions can't happen often, right?
Well, I mean, most people don't think that anybody would confess to something they didn't do. But the research shows that somewhere between 40 to 75% of people who are interrogated will confess, some truthfully, some falsely. And according to the Innocence Project, almost 30% of their DNA exoneration cases were the result of police-induced false confessions.
So we need to be taking a very close look at interrogation tactics. There's got to be some onus on the people who are getting the confessions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so getting a confession is considered an essential part of policing. But the problem is, as a general rule, police are poorly trained about the dangers of false confessions. What I mean is that they're rarely taught how to understand what causes one or how to recognize one. Instead, they're trained to apply pressure tactics to challenge the claims that they didn't commit the crime or to steer the suspect towards admitting their guilt.
So under common interrogation techniques, police are trained to manipulate how a suspect perceives the risks and benefits of confessing. And they do this by first accusing the suspect of lying, refusing to listen to their claims of innocence, and producing evidence, whether real or made up, of their guilt. And then after the suspect is at a point of feeling hopeless, interrogators will then offer them a way out of their situation. Confess and you'll get the Fanta. Confess and everything will be okay. The interrogators will tell the suspect that the benefits of confessing outweigh the costs of continuing to deny their involvement.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty much textbook how it goes. And we know that this approach has a big effect on adults. We know that adults will feel like they have no other option than to confess to a crime that they didn't commit because apparently, the police have my fingerprints or my DNA or whatever else it may be that ties me to the crime. But imagine if these kinds of stunts are being pulled on a child. What kind of effect do you think that would have?
Right. We don't address youth until another episode, but this would be, if it would break an adult, then.
Yeah. Right. Like adults have a hard enough time appreciating what's going on when they're in a situation like this. And I really don't think that a child or a young person would be able to handle this in any kind of meaningful way.
Yeah, and it makes things even more difficult for someone to be able to wrap their head around the gravity of the situation. Interrogators will also minimize or rationalize the suspect's involvement in the crime. So, for example, they'll tell the suspect things like the crime was unintentional or it was an accident or, obviously it was self-defense. Like each of these options are given to the suspect to make confessing seem like it's, it's not that big a deal. These manipulative tactics eventually would overwhelm, let's say, many suspects and cause them to confess whether they're guilty or not. So basically, the police are trained to mess with someone's mind, but not read it. So you can break them, but not necessarily put them back together again. It's a lot of responsibility that I'm sure interrogators, investigators, all of them take very seriously, right?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, officers are usually under a lot of pressure to close a case. And this can lead some of them to use some questionable tactics. Right. And because they're under pressure to close the case, they'll also feel pressure to get a confession because confession evidence is some of the strongest evidence that you can present to a jury.
Yeah, confession is generally seen to be concrete proof of somebody's guilt. And it's always been considered, I guess, the gold standard indicator of guilt. So much so that it tends to dominate all other case evidence and is just so influential that even when exculpatory evidence is presented, it tends to be rationalized away. And the confession will override everything else presented at trial.
Yeah. And again, seems kind of unbelievable, but there are cases where this exact scenario plays out. I mean, we just have to look at the case of Jeffrey Deskovic. So he was 16 years old when his classmate was sexually assaulted and brutally murdered. So long story short, the police interrogate Jeffrey 8 times and they give him a polygraph test. And the whole purpose of the polygraph was to get a confession from Jeffrey. So the confession finally comes after 6 hours of interrogation and 3 polygraph sessions. He was given coffee during this time, but no food. And they just kept pressuring him throughout. And it became so strong that he ended up confessing. And when he did confess, he was curled up in fetal position, crying under the table where the polygraph and interrogation was being conducted. And if this wasn't enough, so there was actually biological evidence left in the case because his classmate had been sexually assaulted, so semen was recovered. The police tested it, and it excluded Jeffrey. He was not anywhere near the classmate when she was murdered. But instead of dropping the case against him, the prosecutor decided to continue with the case based on the strength of his confession. So now you would think that maybe the jury would see that, hey, there's DNA. It doesn't match Jeffrey. And so you would think that they would acquit him. No. They convict him of second-degree murder. And their reasoning was that, the semen probably came from a consensual partner. And Jeffrey was so jealous that he flew into a rage and killed the victim.
Wow. I don't think anyone could have predicted that outcome. Like, aren't we always told that DNA is the thing? It's what matters. So there you go. The DNA is there's the proof.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so yes, that is what we're usually told. Thing is, there's what we logically know, like DNA doesn't lie, but people do, right? And then there's the things that we think we know, like no one would ever confess to something they didn't do. Problem is, like this case shows us, we tend to believe the things that we think we know. They're going to override the things that, like, logically, scientifically, objectively are true, right?
Honestly, that's such a mouthful. And it's so important to hear that. We tend to believe the things that we think we know.
Yeah. Like that's going to override what science tells us.
Yeah. Welcome to the world.
Yeah. And so based on this, something that is kind of a mantra in my class, and I always tell my students, is that if they're ever, God forbid, in this kind of situation, to keep their mouths shut, because everybody stops listening as soon as you confess. Even if you immediately recant your confession, no one's listening to that, right? And then your case is going to move through the justice system. More people are going to become aware of your confession. And then they just join the growing line of people who think you're guilty because you said you did it.
I want to talk to a lawyer.
Yes.
I want to talk to a lawyer. Get me my lawyer.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think this is a great time to hear from a few of our experts.
I agree. And, we're super fortunate today. We're jam-packed with experts. We had the chance to speak with Dr. Lindsay Malloy, who's a developmental psychologist and an expert on confessions, interrogations, and children's memory. And she's conducted research on memory and suggestibility. And she's looked into how we can improve interview and interrogation practices with a particular attention on youth. We also have Dr. Jessica Sutherland, who's a psychological scientist and an expert on adolescent development in the context of the criminal justice system. And her current research focuses on how young people make legal decisions, as well as the development and progression of risky decision-making. And we also have Dr. Hayley Cleary, who's a developmental psychologist and an expert on police interrogations and juvenile justice. Her current research focuses on adolescent behavior and decision-making in justice system contexts, including youth's contact with law enforcement, courts, and corrections, with a special attention to police interrogation of juvenile suspects. It's a fantastic trio, and put together, they all speak to the point of what causes people to falsely confess.
Have a listen to our interview with Hayley Cleary.
Yes, so youth and people with certain types of intellectual disabilities or cognitive impairments are more susceptible to what we call internalized false confessions. So false confessions that are coerced can be sort of subdivided into two groups. Coerced compliant confessions, which is basically asserting your innocence over and over and over until you're finally broken down and you kind of relent to police pressure. And then these internalized confessions, which sort of go a step further, and the person begins to doubt their own memory about what happened. And it's hard to pinpoint a prevalence of these types of occurrences because we don't track false confessions. Detectives and police agencies don't track all of their interrogations. But from what we've seen kind of archivally and using other research methods, internalized false confessions are not as common as the coerced compliant confessions, but they do happen. There have been some very famous examples. And, a certain combination of vulnerabilities, right? Suggestibility, tendency toward compliance, trauma, all of those things that can interfere with decision making, and lead folks under certain circumstances to really start to question their own memory of what actually occurred.
I just want to touch on something that you said. In wrongful conviction studies, we have no idea how frequently wrongful convictions happen because it can only be asserted to be wrongful once it's overturned on appeal. And so, you could be in prison saying, I didn't do it. Doesn't matter. Your conviction is just a conviction as far as the courts are concerned. And I feel like this is probably true with false confessions as well, because people can instantly recant their confession. We don't know if it's a true recantation or not, right? Like we can only prove it once it has, or we can only count it as a false confession once it's been proven to be false.
Is training the answer? Or is it that, the implementation of an independent body to review or be present during interrogations? Or are we just headed for a world of Minority Report? What is the answer?
One thing that can help is bringing in experts into the courtroom to educate the jury about the science, the overrepresentation of youth in documented cases of false confession. If we're lucky enough to have a recording of the interrogation, like Brendan Dassey's case, the expert can walk the jury through and say, here's what you see happening. Here's how we explain that scientifically. I mean, I'm always very upfront with police officers, whether it's a local police department or it's the FBI, National Academy. I'm very honest and transparent and say, look, I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job. I could never do your job. You have experience that I don't have as a practitioner. That experience is valuable. But what I try to help them understand is we can bring in lessons that we've learned from science to supplement their experience, not to replace it. Because in an investigative capacity, officers' instincts are important and useful and valuable. And same thing for judges. There's never, the goal is not to tell folks that they've been doing things wrong, but it's to say, here we have these tools and these lessons from science that can help you do your job better. So that's the approach that I generally take. And I think the message gets across a little bit more smoothly that way. Recording can fix a lot of these problems, or at least ameliorate a lot of these problems. And that is something that has taken off from a policy perspective that is tremendously exciting. And there are differences between video recording and audio recording, where obviously video is more useful than audio. Once I started reading about interrogation, I realized how high the stakes are, right? Because it's a gateway to the criminal justice system for youth who are unaware of how the system works. They have all of these developmentally driven vulnerabilities because they're works in progress. And the more I studied it, the more I became drawn to figuring out ways to understand what happens in this process and how we can create sort of empirically driven fixes, right? Data-driven solutions on the policy side, on the training and practice side, to reduce or, who knows, maybe even eliminate these inaccurate and horrific outcomes.
And now, have a listen to highlights from our interview with Lindsay Malloy and Jessica Sutherland.
There was a study that came out a few years ago that found that in general, practitioners that responded, the American and the Canadian practitioners, were really similar to one another in terms of what kind of techniques they were using. Whereas some of the other countries they looked at, like Europe, Australia, New Zealand, they were more using the information gathering approach to interrogation. And in North America, across the board, the accusatorial style was more likely. So, and that's a pretty big deal. There are some people who've made some headway in Canada. So like some individual areas that are now using more of an information gathering approach, but by and large, it's still the accusatorial style. I think mandatory electronic recording of all interrogations, juveniles and adults, is really important, and avoiding deception. So I think one of the big things, especially for vulnerable people, but not even just for vulnerable individuals like juveniles or those with intellectual disabilities, but for everyone, I think lying in the interrogation room, it just not only can it lead to miscarriages of justice, but it just also can undermine the public's confidence in the legal system and in the police. And there's many people now who are calling for the end of this practice. And, the UK has ended this practice and it hasn't seemed to affect their conviction rates and such. And so I think that those are the two that really come to mind. I think if we're going to talk about juveniles, you could even add in things like maybe time limits on interrogations, having a friendly adult present, not just an adult, but a friendly adult, and one hopefully who's knowledgeable, like whether that's an attorney or a professional adult advocate who is knowledgeable about the legal system.
I like to think of myself as a fairly strong individual, but I don't know that I could have somebody coming at me for 6 or 8 hours telling me that I'm a liar, that I'm wrong, that they have all of this made up evidence that I may or may not know is made up. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, there's got to be a respite in there somewhere, because they can swap out and they can shift off because it's too long to be doing this for this long, right? So why can't I swap out for a little bit and take a nap and food and a shower and come back?
Yeah, no, I think that's valid. And even if you look at the Reed manual, they say that interrogation shouldn't take more than 4 hours. And so if you're going into the 6, 8, 10, or even more for some people mark, like that is, it's really, I can't imagine, I've done like expert witness testimony where I've been grilled for an hour and a half or something, and that feels like an eternity. And that's not in a small room where you don't have access to anyone else to give you any information. You have no idea. It's just, I shudder to think at how long I could last, really. But especially for someone like a teenager, so having those time limits would be useful. Some of the other stuff, though, I think is even easier to implement, like especially the electronic recording. Nowadays, I just don't think we have very many excuses for that. It used to be very expensive to do that. Now everyone has recording devices on their phones, and it's not expensive, and storage is not as much of an issue because we can store these things electronically. So it just seems like that is a really common sense measure. And there's research showing that once police departments implement it, that the officers are really pro recording the interrogations as well. So they have to spend less time in court because they don't have to go and testify as much anymore. And they are protected from any claims that, they roughed someone up or something like that, because it's all recorded. So even though there can be some resistance at first, there have been people who've looked into this that generally find that they're really happy with the procedure once they start it. For me, how much people believe confessions, sort of no matter what, right? Like irrespective of other evidence, irrespective of what has happened in the interrogation, it's really, really hard for people to discount confession evidence. And there have been cases like Jeffrey Deskovic's case comes to mind. He was a juvenile in New York where the DNA didn't match him. In the end, he confessed because he's like, well, they're telling me they have DNA and I know that it wasn't me. So I'm just going to say now that I did it, and then it will all come out in the wash, soon. And, the DNA didn't match him, but the jury still convicted him because it was so hard for them to not believe his confession that he's the one who did it. So that really blows my mind. Like how much people can believe something in spite of other evidence. Although maybe it shouldn't, because there's other examples of life, right? Like there are people who don't believe COVID is real. And, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. So I don't think it's something that's unique to false confessions per se, but it does kind of blow my mind.
Canadian culture is so influenced by American culture, right? And there's, we don't have the term felony in Canada, right? But many Canadians would probably use the term felon or felony as something that's relevant for them, but we don't actually use that in our legal terminology.
Or Miranda.
And even things, Miranda is another big one, right? Like we have similar statements that police will make to you, but they're not called Miranda rights, right? So I think Canadians would probably be quite influenced by American terminology and American legal terms that we just don't really use here. Although
and that in itself could be a detriment.
Yeah.
Yeah,
one of our grad students at Ontario Tech, who works with Joe Eastwood, who does a lot of work on, I almost said understanding of Miranda rights, but no, of the police caution. They were finding that, and I'm, going off of my memory here, but basically that a lot of Canadians were getting their legal knowledge from American television in terms of what their rights were to have, an attorney present in the interrogation room with them, rather than just the opportunity to consult, which could happen on the phone. They don't have to actually be physically present in Canada, but a lot of people thought that they had to be because of, watching Law and Order and things. So it is
Motion
interesting.
to dismiss.
Yes.
Well, and there's the belief that, and I believe this is true in America, all you have to say is lawyer and questioning has to stop. Not the same in Canada.
Mm-hmm. What
right?
do you have to say here?
No, in America, all you have to say is lawyer, or I want to speak to my lawyer. Mm-hmm. And that stops the interrogation until an attorney is present. Here, they can keep questioning you. It does, just because you say,
no
I want,
word?
You can invoke your right to silence. You can stop speaking, but it does not mean that they have to stop questioning you. In America, they do.
Yeah.
As soon as you say the word lawyer, they need to cease and desist questioning. Here, you say, I want to speak to my lawyer. And they're like, great, but where were you last night?
Mm-hmm. Feels like no means yes.
Yeah, it's really weird to me that when I learned that, I was really shocked. Well, what's the point of invoking your rights if they can keep? Because it's so hard for people. I think I'd find it really hard if someone was still peppering me with questions to just sit there in silence.
I don't feel like we've looked at this as closely in the Canadian context. So I don't think there's been as much experimental work actually looking at how do people, give confessions under the way that our police do interrogations right now. At least not that I'm aware of. I don't feel like we've interrogated, to use that word, our criminal justice practices as closely as American researchers have. I think we've sort of been taking for granted that findings from the US and other jurisdictions can hold up here, but we do have a different criminal justice system. And I think we do need to be looking more closely at how our practices actually support or don't support people making adaptive decisions when they become involved in the justice system. Mm-hmm. I think we have a pretty strong forensic research system in Canada, in terms of how we understand offenders with mental illness. I think we have really strong researchers in sexual offending, for example. But I'm talking about just, what do interrogations in Canada actually look like for youth and adults, right? How do people actually understand Canadian rights in the criminal justice system? I don't think we're looking as closely at that. I think, too, a challenge with some psych and law issues is a lot of people don't understand how they can happen because sometimes they're paradoxical, right? So if you're a member of a jury and you're a woman or a Black person or an Asian person and the defendant or the victim is the same, demographic profile as you, I think it's hard not to put yourself in the same situation and say, well, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't falsely confess. Mm-hmm. I would be fine under duress, and you probably would not.
Yeah.
Right. Or there's a good reason to believe that you wouldn't, but we all like to think the best of ourselves and that we would make different choices.
Thank you so much to our guests for all of their unbelievable research. And I don't know, what else would you call it? Is it all research?
And insight.
And insight. So Romeo's case is a very interesting and unique tale of a false confession. While we usually think of false confessions resulting from, let's say, coercive interrogation tactics, there are a number of ways that false confessions come up, as we've spoken about. But no matter what form it takes, the consequences of a false confession are inevitably the same. So let's just break down Romeo's case even further.
Right. So like we talked about, on August 9, 1967, a firefighter named Leopold Roy was stabbed to death by an unknown assailant. And the firefighter's wife later described the attacker to the police, who then placed Romeo in a lineup shortly after the murder. And the wife was able to get a look at Romeo and said that she wasn't sure, but she thought maybe Romeo resembled the man who had killed her husband. But because she couldn't make a positive ID, Romeo was released. Case goes unsolved for the next 4.5 years. Now, we have to think, having a high-profile murder case like this go unsolved for almost 5 years must have been super taxing on the police. And surely they were eager to close the case. But there weren't any leads, so there wasn't really much that they could do. Until January 1972, when Romeo was arrested for the armed robbery of the taxi driver. And while he's being interrogated for that, he just randomly asks the detective if his partner told them anything. And like I say, this seems like an odd question to ask. And I would like to think that the detectives probably should have been alerted to the fact that something weird was going on here. But instead, the police play along, hoping to get some information. And they said, yep, your partner divulged a lot of things you bragged about. So let's keep in mind, the armed robbery charge that he's facing right now was completely unrelated to the murder of the firefighter. And it was 4.5 years after the fact. But wanting to look like a tough guy, Romeo just spontaneously confesses to that murder. So like we talked about, this is a prime example of a voluntary confession. And there's a lot of different reasons why they happen. Like sometimes people come forward and confess to something because they're trying to protect someone else, or, they're seeking notoriety, or maybe they have a mental illness. And I think it's really worth noting that in Romeo's case, when he was at trial, he presented 2 expert witnesses who testified that Romeo suffered from antisocial personality disorder, and this made him far more likely to lie and invent stories that would make him feel important. And they testified that confessing to the murder was most likely prompted by his need to feel important, because by confessing, he instantly became the centerpiece of the case.
Right. In hindsight, it's easy to look at this confession with suspicion. But at the time, the police must have felt like this was a gift from the crime-fighting gods. Like, here you have a person in custody for one violent offense, and he ends up confessing to another, and arguably more. So, that would definitely feel like a win. And also at a time, where I don't think maybe mental illness or things of that nature would have been as considered as they are now.
Yeah. I mean, I would tend to agree with that because, mental illness has really only gained a lot of, it's only become to the fore in recent years. So yeah, certainly in the 70s, I doubt it was on anybody's radar.
And even though it's on the radar now, our interrogators, are they looking out for things like that? Just because there's more awareness doesn't mean in the moment, that's something that they're checking off their list. I think this is still something that could happen to anyone.
100%. I mean, it goes back to what we were just talking about, how, we tend to believe the things that we think we know rather than the things we objectively know. So we may know about mental illness, but, we may not consider it because it doesn't infiltrate our daily thoughts and what we think we know. Anyhow, Romeo recanted his confession to another officer on the same night that he made the false confession. And, he told the officer that he was innocent and that he and his partner had come up with a scheme, and it was all just in an effort to collect the reward money. But, like we said, despite the quick recantation, the damage to his case had been done. And, it was basically undoable at this point. And, as is often the case, as soon as somebody confesses to crime, no one's interested in looking into the facts any further.
Yeah, see, in Romeo's case, the police didn't consider whether it was even possible for him to have committed the offense if he had an alibi. They didn't think about the reward money as being a possible influence in the confession. So they just closed the book on the case and moved forward. Romeo's trial began on October 16th, 1972. The Crown's case was built around the firefighter's wife's identification and Romeo's confession. Romeo's defense counsel argued that despite these confessions, his client was innocent, and it was argued that because of his mental illness, he craved attention, and in his mind, negative attention, in Romeo's mind, negative attention was still attention. Despite the evidence and the recanted confession, the jury found Romeo guilty on November 7th, 1972, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no parole eligibility for 10 years. And after his conviction, Romeo maintained his innocence. And even though he could have applied for parole after 10 years, he refused to do so because he felt that applying for parole would be the same as admitting that he was guilty. So he remained in prison for more than 20 years before his case took a surprising twist, when his parole officer gave him an envelope containing a report that was prepared by the investigating officer during the initial investigation of Romeo's involvement in the Leopold Roy's murder. The report showed that Romeo was 200 kilometers away from Ottawa at the time of the murder. Romeo had tried to tell everyone he had a solid alibi, but it was never looked into because he had confessed.
Yeah. So jumping at the opportunity to be able to tell his side of the story, he sent the report to the Innocence Project at Osgoode Hall Law School. And in 2003, they submitted an application to the Minister of Justice for review. And finally, after spending 31 years in prison, he was granted bail pending the outcome of the application. The minister decided that the new evidence raised serious questions about whether Romeo had received a fair trial and had therefore been wrongfully convicted. So with that, Romeo's case was sent back to the Court of Appeal for consideration, and they ordered a retrial because they felt Romeo hadn't received a fair trial. So, things are sounding great, except not everyone was so agreeable. The Crown felt that too much time had passed since the murder, so it would be pointless to try the case again. I mean, at this point, it's been 36 years. Good luck finding anyone who could remember anything and testify meaningfully, right?
Well, and we know that we can't trust memory anyway, let alone 36 years later.
Exactly. So the Crown withdrew the charges, which seems like a good thing, but it left Romeo in a precarious, complicated kind of position because he was no longer convicted of the murder, but without a retrial, he couldn't prove that he'd been the victim of a miscarriage of justice.
Okay, so he's released, but now he's saying there should be some accountability for this?
Well, he wants to be able to prove that he was actually innocent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right now, they're saying, okay, well, there's not enough evidence to say that it was you, but we're not saying that it wasn't you. So he's kind of in this limbo stage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So after leaving prison in July of 2003, Romeo lived very carefully on his old age pension. And because he'd been in prison for so long, he maintained his prison hours and his prison habits. He'd get up at 3 a.m. every day to take care of his cats. And then he'd go to bed between 8 and 9 at night. And he tried to make the most of his time, and he would speak at wrongful conviction events. And when he was home, he would cook the simple meals that he learned how to do in prison. So he's still in this limbo phase, and he sought damages from the province of Ontario in 2012, but the claim was dismissed.
Okay, so compensation or no compensation. That's the the WTF question.
Yeah.
Yeah. How does that work? In May 2013, Romeo was denied the right to sue for compensation, but that decision was overturned on appeal. And in February 2015, the Supreme Court gave him the right to proceed with his civil case. But sadly, Romeo passed away on November 2nd, 2015, without ever receiving any compensation for all of that time he spent locked up for a crime he didn't commit.
Yeah, it was really sad. I mean, I was one of the lucky ones who got to call Romeo my friend. And I can tell you that he argued until his death that the Crown challenged his right to seek compensation. Like, they just kept putting up roadblocks to try to avoid having to own up to their own mistakes in his case. And when you listen to him tell it, it was really hard not to see why he felt that way. And I mean, given his inordinately long ordeal and his experience, he was a staunch supporter of others who had been wrongfully convicted. And he always made himself available to attend their court hearings. And he was always there to encourage them and to listen to them because they often needed it, right? Having been in their position for such a long time, he understood the trauma and the pain of being wrongfully convicted. And to this day, Romeo remains the longest serving innocent Canadian to have a murder conviction overturned.
Wow. I mean, let's hope that record will never be surpassed.
Agreed.
31 years. How do we help a human system avoid human errors like these?
That is a great question. One of the biggest strides that we've made is that, and it's gaining steam across different police forces around the world, is that they're acknowledging that the traditional methods of interrogating a suspect are dangerous, that they will, or they can and they will, elicit a false confession. And because of this, they're moving towards a new model of interrogation. And it's what's known as the PEACE model. So PEACE stands for preparation and planning, engage and explain, account, closure, and evaluate. And so these are all the steps that a successful interrogation should follow. So with PEACE, investigators are allowing a suspect to tell their story without interruption before they point out any inconsistencies or contradictions between what the suspect is telling them and then what the evidence is telling them. So it makes for the process to seem more like a formal interview rather than constantly being confrontational, right? And we're not going to threaten them of withholding a Fanta, you know? Mm-hmm. So they're still looking for a confession, but the interview is actually trying to establish a rapport rather than to belittle them and berate them the whole time.
This is great relationship practice. Like, you know, you're having an argument. Wait, peace. Let's start with peace.
One thing too that I think we all need to remember is that we're all the jury pool, right? We are all potential jurors. And that means we can be called on at any time to judge somebody's fate. So we too need to be aware, right? We need to know that just because somebody said they did something doesn't mean that they actually did it.
Next time you feel like spilling the beans, think about it. Say you want to talk to your lawyer and keep your mouth shut. Warning, this tactic doesn't work if your spouse or partner wants to know who ate all the ice cream. Like, just fess up. Mm-hmm. The world of wrongful convictions is a living hell for individuals who end up in it. And believe it or not, it could happen to anyone. Know the law, know how to look for flaws in the system, understand how marginalization works, and most of all, talk about it. Thanks for joining us. I'm Kelly Fanson.
And I'm Kelly Loza.
All of us could falsely confess to something.
They blew it all out of proportion, and they got away with it.
Even a country like Canada has people who are charged and convicted of crimes they didn't commit.
There's innocent people who are going to die in prison.
I can't get back the time that they took from me.
And I was just left wondering, like, what the hell is happening?
I knew my life was over right there. That's when my life ended.
They're changing the story that I told them to match to what really happened.
I was just incarcerated for 37 years for somebody else's crime.
That what happened to me could easily happen to anybody.
Real Life Wrongs is produced by Kelly Fanson, edited by Alex Glutch, promotional materials by Jamie Norrie.